The bells rang one last time, not with joy, with a warning. High in the hills of Thessaly, under cracked frescoes and olive trees tossed by an autumn wind, a small convent waited for the end. They didn't know that this night would be written across two worlds, the one they had lived in and the one history would try to erase. What happened next would become a whisper in palace halls, a rumor on the docks, and, centuries later, a scratch on stone that archaeologists could not ignore. This is the story of the nuns who refused to kneel. If you love forgotten histories from the edges of empires, make sure to subscribe, because we bring the past back to life, one lost legacy at a time. It began the way many conquests begin. Banners on the horizon, red as embers, cutting across the mountain ridges. Ottoman standards rising where olive trees bent in the wind. The convent's abbess, Sister Eleni of Lissa, stood before a tarnished silver crucifix and told her sisters to keep their vows in their hearts. She believed vows were armor. She was wrong about one thing. Armor can crack. When the guns came, they didn't aim for the icons or the relics. They aimed for the message. In every empire, holy places were more than stone. They were declarations of identity. So when the Ottoman troops surrounded the convent, they weren't just taking land. They were erasing a statement. We are still here. The first cannonballs shattered the gates. By sundown, the cloister walls glowed orange with fire. By dawn, the bell tower's cross was gone, melted down into coins. But what the soldiers expected, screaming, begging, surrender, never came. The surviving sisters were marched into the courtyard, torchlight flickering against their habits. The captain offered mercy. Renounce your vows, embrace the empire's faith, and live. Refuse, and suffer the consequences. Sister Eleni looked up at the burning sky and said quietly, I have already given my life. What else can you take? That single sentence sealed their fate. 22 women were taken away that night, bound for the coast. They walked for 7 days under the hard Thessalian sun. Imagine lives once measured in bells, prayers, and quiet chores, suddenly thrown into the dust of the road. When one stumbled, another lifted her veil so a horseman wouldn't trample it. That small act, a gesture of dignity in a world stripped of mercy, stayed with them. At Volos, they reached the sea. They were herded onto ships meant for cargo, not for people. An overseer kept a ledger, spices, silver, linen, and, written in the margins, 22 captives, female. Those ships, creaking in the wind, carried them for 12 days through storms and silence. One of the younger sisters, Magdalena, whispered psalms to herself each night. Prisoners from other lands heard her through the planks and began to hum along. For a few moments, on that dark sea, the world paused, a faint chorus of faith echoing over the waves. Then the Bosphorus opened before them, and Constantinople appeared like a vision of stone and gold. Domes and minarets glittered in the sunlight. For centuries, it had been the jewel of empires, a city conquered and reconquered. For these women, it would become their cage. They were led through crowded streets, where merchants called out and children stared. Eventually, they reached the imperial complex near Hagia Sophia, part palace, part prison. The Grand Vizier presided over their arrival. A scribe recorded each woman's name, age, and fate. The Sultan offered what he called mercy, conversion, and a new life in the palace, or refusal and what the records politely called discipline of faith. That phrase, discipline of faith, hides so much. It was bureaucracy doing what it does best, turning cruelty into paperwork. Some women, broken by exhaustion, accepted conversion. Their names vanished from the ledgers after that. Others refused. They were numbered, not named, and sent to the lowest chambers of the palace. For most people, this would have been the end of the story. Their silence, their defeat, but that silence turned out to be their greatest weapon. Beneath the palace gardens lay corridors, and storage halls carved into the bedrock, a labyrinth where light barely reached. The nuns were made to work there as servants, cleaning marble floors, tending fires, invisible to the world above. They were expected to disappear quietly. Instead, they began to resist in the only ways left to them. They stopped speaking the language of their captors. They refused to answer questions except with prayer. When officials came to test their loyalty, they simply bowed their heads and said nothing. Their silence unsettled everyone. One overseer called it the quiet that unnerved soldiers more than screams. Among them was Sister Dearest, once known for her sharp tongue in the convent. When a guard mocked her, asking for her name, she replied, "Call me Silence." And from that day, she was known by no other word. In time, they discovered a forgotten archway beneath the storerooms, a narrow crack in the wall that led to an unused chamber. It smelled of damp stone and centuries of neglect. There, with bits of pottery for candle holders and a scrap of linen for an altar, they created a secret chapel. They scratched tiny crosses into the walls with nails and bone shards. Every night, when footsteps above faded, they whispered the hymns they had sung at home for months, maybe years. Nobody knows how long. That secret chapel became their last sanctuary. The empire might have claimed their bodies, but it could not reach that hidden corner of faith. Centuries passed. Empires fell. New ones rose. The palace became a museum of itself. The nuns' story faded into rumor, a legend whispered by servants and traders. Official records were silent, but the silence was suspicious. Venetian envoys wrote cryptic letters about the women of the shadow halls. A Turkish courtier's diary mentioned prisoners who pray without names. Then the world moved on. However, history has a peculiar way of preserving what people try to erase. In the early 20th century, archaeologists began excavating the old imperial palace, peeling back the layers of centuries like pages in a forgotten book. Most of what they found was expected: mosaics, broken marble, fragments of royal life. Until one morning, when a worker's pick struck something hollow, they found a sealed underground chamber. When the dust cleared, the air inside smelled of age and something else, something almost sacred. On the walls were dozens of small crosses, scratched by hand. Near one corner was a Latin phrase: Lux in tenebris lucet. The light shines in the darkness. The tools nearby were makeshift: pottery shards, bits of bone, pieces of iron. Each one bore marks of use, of persistence. Those carvings matched none of the official Christian sites in the city. There were no mosaics, no icons, no gilded relics, only the raw language of survival. Scholars eventually dated them to the 15th or 16th century, exactly the period when the convent of Thessaly vanished from all records. It's tempting to romanticize it, but the facts themselves are powerful enough. Every cross on that wall was the mark of a person who refused to vanish. Every scratch was an act of defiance against the silence of empire. And so the question lingers: what is victory? The world often celebrates conquerors and generals, but these women, who left no monuments, no tombs, no titles, may have achieved something greater. They turned their suffering into testimony. Even in chains, they wrote their own ending. They couldn't stop the fall of their convent or the collapse of kingdoms, but they could make sure that their truth outlasted those who tried to bury it. Centuries later, we are still talking about them, proof that faith, in any form, can echo longer than power. It's strange to think about how many stories like this are lost, erased by time, rewritten by victors, or forgotten. Yet now and then, history gives us a small miracle: a carved word, a half-burned letter, a line of song that refuses to fade. That's what these women gave us. Their story reminds us that courage isn't always loud. Sometimes it's quiet, patient, hidden in the dark. Sometimes it's the whisper that says, "I am still here," when the world wants silence. And maybe that's the real message of this story. You don't have to win to endure. You don't have to shout to be remembered. You only have to keep your light alive long enough for someone somewhere to find it again. So if this story moved you, if you felt that quiet kind of strength, let us know in the comments which moment stayed with you the most. Was it the march through Thessaly, the whispered hymns in the palace, or the crosses carved into stone? If you want to hear more forgotten histories like this, stories of people who stood their ground when the world turned against them, make sure to like the video, subscribe, and ring the bell. It helps more than you think, and it keeps these lost voices alive. They could melt the bells and tear down the walls. They could erase the names from the ledgers, but they could never erase what was carved into the dark. In every age, some try to silence others, to bury their faith, their language, their truth, but history always leaves fingerprints. Every wall remembers the hand that built it. Every melody remembers the voice that first sang it. Every flame remembers the one who dared to light it. And sometimes, that's all it takes. A mark, a whisper, a spark. Their courage may have been quiet, but it still echoes louder than the empires that tried to drown it. So when you see an old stone, or a faded symbol carved by hands long gone, remember this story. Remember that light doesn't need permission to return. Even the faintest flame can outlive the longest night. Thank you for watching, for listening, and for helping these voices be heard again. Until next time, remember, history isn't just what's written, it's what survives. And somewhere, carved deep into the dark, a light still burns. burns. The story of the Thessalian sisters is not just a fragment of history. It's a mirror, a reflection of every person who ever stood against the tide and refused to be silenced. Their hands are long gone, but their marks remain, etched deep into stone and memory alike. Somewhere beneath the polished marble of empires and the dust of centuries, there is always another hidden story waiting to be uncovered. Maybe it's buried in a forgotten archive. Maybe it's whispered in a language no one has spoken for generations. Or maybe it's right there, in a faint carving that someone once made with trembling hands and unbreakable faith. The nuns of Thessaly are gone, but their voices are not. They live in every act of defiance that refuses to fade, in every truth that outlasts power, in every small flame that dares to burn against the wind. If you've followed their journey this far, you've helped keep that flame alive. And when one story like this is remembered, it opens the door for the next one to rise from the shadows. So as the screen fades and the music carries the final notes, let this story linger a little longer. Picture the quiet chapel beneath the palace, the candles still burning beside the wall of crosses, and know that somewhere, right now, another forgotten story is waiting to be found. Stay curious, stay brave, and keep the light alive.